The impudence, the audacity, the unmitigated gall of those Knuckleheads of Liberty podcasters, daring to voice opinions outside the mainstream of accepted thought. Listen if you dare. It's angry, it's funny, it's even sometimes sad, but it's always based on freedom and justice, as you will see. Here's our host, Jason McPhee.
Welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty. We're coming at you on December 19th, 2022, just a week before Christmas. And maybe our biggest Christmas gift is we're halfway through the Biden administration. I don't know. But before we get to, before diving into any more of that stuff, we have a great opportunity on the show to talk with the Liberty Justice Center, and they are currently in the works of a lawsuit fighting back for the freedoms of our doctors in this state to be able to speak openly with their patients about COVID. So that's something that's currently in front of the courts. But before we jump into that and a few other lawsuits, let me introduce you to our panel. In our upper left-hand corner, we have Leon the Word Brathwaite, last word in Liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. In our upper right-hand corner, we have our screaming eagle of freedom, Tim Everett. He is a pilot in the state of California. In our lower left-hand corner, we have our special guest today, Jacob Hubert, and he is the president of the Liberty Justice Center, and he's also a practicing attorney as well. But yeah, we're thrilled to have him on the show today because, right now we're fighting for liberty in the courts here in California. I mean, it seems like we're always fighting for liberty here in California because there's always a push by our government. But maybe we could get the visual up, James, to show what's going on. So just wanted to show this is the Liberty Justice Center in case you want to find out a little more about the organization. It's libertyjusticecenter.org. But specifically the case that we're talking about here, it's a case called McDonald versus Lawson, and it involves essentially our state legislature and our Governor Newsom have passed a law to say that, hey, look, if you don't follow the script on COVID, you may lose your license. So when we saw this constantly throughout the pandemic, where some doctors would speak up and they'd say, hey, this isn't quite what I'm seeing, whatever the national narrative is on it, or if the CDC is saying one thing, maybe they saw something else and they're trying to talk about it. And now they're trying to put this into law that, hey, if you do this in California as a doctor, you won't just be silenced on social media. We might take your license away. So anyways, go ahead, Jacob. I'll let you dive into more of the details since you're definitely the expert on this one.
Yeah, well, a few months ago, Governor Gavin Newsom signed a new law in California that says that doctors can be professionally disciplined or even have their licenses revoked if they give their patients misinformation about COVID-19. And this law defines misinformation as anything that goes against the scientific consensus, with no definition for what scientific consensus is. So if you're a doctor and you say the wrong thing to your patient about COVID, they can claim it's against the scientific consensus, and they can severely disrupt your livelihood. And of course, that is going to severely, potentially chill doctors' speech when talking to their patients about COVID, because they don't even know what they can and can't say. The supposed consensus is changing all the time. Of course, the whole concept of a scientific consensus is rather anti-scientific. And so we represent two doctors there in California, Mark McDonald and Jeff Barkey, who for a long time since COVID hit were taking views on COVID that were outside of the official approved positions at the time, things to do perhaps with how effective masks are, what the COVID vaccines can and can't do, that sort of thing. And if this law had been in effect back when they started saying these things, they might well have gotten in trouble for saying the things that they said. And so they were very alarmed when they saw this coming through the legislature there in California. And so we were prepared to file a lawsuit on their behalf as soon as it was signed, arguing that this violates their First Amendment right. their right to speak freely to their patients. Of course, you don't give up your First Amendment rights just because you're in a profession. Of course, the First Amendment covers all kinds of speech, including professional speech, medical speech. And so we argue that this law violates their First Amendment rights, and we're seeking to have a federal court enjoin it, to block it before it takes effect as it's scheduled to on January 1st.
You know, you always have to wonder what it is that these people are trying to hide. I mean, what is the point of having such a law when we always searching for more better ways to do things, you know, whether it's treating COVID or treating anything else for that matter. We are always searching for ways to do this. And usually when you're in your search for ways to do these sort of things, to improve the technology, to improve the scientific knowledge, you always have to go against the so-called consensus. I mean, you just have to wonder what the hell it is that they're trying to cover, what it is that they're trying to protect us from. It's really mystifying to me.
Well, right. Well, that's how it's been with COVID from the beginning, right? Where the government decides what the official line on these things is going to be and enforces it and discourages dissent or free inquiry. And of course, we've seen lots of suppression of unapproved views in various ways. We've seen and we see more and more evidence of the government colluding with social media companies, pressuring social media companies to take down unapproved views. In fact, we represent somebody, Justin Hart, who's on Twitter saying a lot about COVID over the years and was censored in connection with the Biden administration, saying that we need to fight misinformation on social media. And so, you know, what are the motivations for this? Well, of course, the government likes power, it likes control, and it sees that opportunity with COVID. And maybe the details are some of the details are just arbitrary. Maybe some of the details of what they're doing are serving special interests. But in any event, whether they have good reasons or bad reasons, they don't have a good enough reason to violate doctors' First Amendment rights.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny too, because you know, the whole point of science, and certainly medicine is part of the sciences. The whole point of it is to have open inquiry. I mean, that's the whole point, is objectivism and open inquiry, and the idea that somebody is going to tell everybody from the top what is and isn't. You know, the idea that science is an authoritative process. That's kind of missing the whole point. You know, certainly somebody can be an authority if they've spent years and they have good information and people respect what they say, but it's not about them dictating what it is that people have to believe. And that's sort of what, you know, I guess our legislator and Mr. Newsom seem to have missed in this whole thing.
No, it's a totally anti-scientific attitude, and it's especially ridiculous in the context of COVID, where something is new, our understanding of it is constantly changing. It makes no sense whatsoever to shut down discussion on this and to let doctors figure out what they think works, let people look at the evidence and advise their patients as best they can accordingly.
You know, Jacob, and the danger. Go ahead, Jason. Go ahead.
Well, I did want to ask one other question on this too, and it's about, is this effort that's going on in California, are there other states that are trying to adopt this, or is the federal government trying to push for some restriction on doctors' speech as well, or is this just sort of limited to California at the moment?
As far as I know, California is the only state where they've actually passed a law on this. There are some other states that have medical boards that have essentially said this, that if you say the wrong thing about COVID, you could be subject to professional discipline from the medical board. And we're definitely interested in challenging those as well. But cementing it into law is even worse. So California, I would say, is the worst on this. But yes, the medical establishment in other states has tried to do this as well.
You know, and the dangers in this law is that, let us suppose that this law is allowed to stand. I hope to God it does not, but let us suppose it is allowed to stand. Could you imagine what's next? So what next? They're going to tell engineers that they cannot say certain things. They're going to tell taxi
pilots.
Pilots. Yeah, pilots. You tell pilots They cannot say certain things, or what? What is next? You could see the slippery slope we are on if this thing is allowed to stand. This is a dangerous law, dangerous at its very core.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why we consider it very important to challenge it immediately and hopefully get some court decisions saying that this isn't permissible. So it'll stop here.
Indeed.
So what's the process look like when you go about doing that? So I think about that, and with various laws, a law comes up and it seems to me on the face of it to be unconstitutional, but it just apparently takes somebody to challenge it. In other words, they get in trouble for breaking the law, and then at that point they challenge it. So what's basically, I mean, just to a layman, what's the process look like?
Well, one of the biggest challenges of doing public interest legal work like we do is to find the plaintiffs who are in a position to challenge the law and willing to challenge the law. And, of course, sometimes somebody has a problem and they just come to us with it. And so that part is taken care of. But if you see a law coming along and you want to do something about it in the courts, we have to find the right person. And so what we did in this case, what we often do is kind of reach out into our networks to say, hey, do you know any doctors in California who might be affected by this? If so, we'd be interested in talking to them. And then through that, you get introduced to them. You find out if they're actually interested and make sure they're actually on the same page as you as far as what we want to do. And so we're very fortunate to get connected with our two doctor plaintiffs in this case to bring this lawsuit. Other time, and it makes sense that it wouldn't be that hard, in as much as this directly affects these doctors' livelihoods. They need to challenge this to keep doing what they want to do with their careers. In some cases, you want to bring it's harder because people may think that, well, I would like to see a law struck down, but I don't want to be the one to stick my neck out. I don't know how the government might retaliate against me if I bring this lawsuit. We bring lawsuits against the public sector unions where they're taking people's money, but it's a small amount of money for any given person sometimes. And they may think, well, I don't want to give the unions this money. I don't like what they're doing, but these unions are big and powerful and they're not known to deal really nicely with people who cross them. So maybe I'll let somebody else do that. But fortunately, we find brave people who care a lot that let us do this work.
Jacob, you just raised this thing about the public employee unions, and if I could go back to the Janus decision here, just a little bit. If a law is found to be unconstitutional, as the Janus decision was, if it's found unconstitutional, does not mean it was unconstitutional. Not only that the fact it's unconstitutional at this point in time, does not mean it was unconstitutional at the time of its enactment. Does that also mean that?
Yes, right. That's true, and that's how courts should treat it. They should, if it's unconstitutional now, if we assume the Constitution always means the same thing, as we should, then that means it was unconstitutional before. It means taking money from people wrongly violated their constitutional rights, and it also means that people should get money back that they wrongfully paid. If the government was unconstitutionally taking people's money, giving it to a union, well, that money should have to be paid back. And in fact, we brought a number of lawsuits across the country after the Janus decision, trying to get back the money that people had been forced to pay. Unfortunately, the courts pretty consistently said no, even though it doesn't really make any sense to say no. They said, well, these unions, they thought it, they believed it was okay at the time. They acted in good faith. So we're going to make an exception to the usual rule here, essentially. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how it's supposed to work. I think courts were just a little squeamish because of just how much money these unions would have had to pay back and what it would have meant for them. And this is a general challenge in our work, that courts, they generally don't want to be particularly bold. They don't want to feel like they're doing something new or something that's going to be highly controversial. Obviously, sometimes they do. The Supreme Court obviously is sometimes willing to do that. But it can be a challenge to get judges to do the right thing if they feel like it's a bold step on their part. So you're absolutely right. These decisions should be retroactive, and people should get compensated for past wrongs.
Because I
Well,
was going to raise this very issue with you, because for 28 and a half years, I paid against my will. I paid money to a public employee union, and I was wondering if I was entitled. But you answered the question. Thank you.
Well, they rounded up those Jewish people and put them into the gas chambers, thinking the law was correct at the time, too.
Yeah.
Damn.
Well, there is a question I wanted to ask on this topic, though, before we move on as well, and that's that one of the issues, we look at this as this impacting just doctors' rights, but it impacts patients' rights too, in the sense that we as patients can't necessarily get an honest discussion with our doctor on this issue.
Right.
And so the issue is, I guess, did you guys were you successful in getting an injunction on this? And if not, roughly, what's the time frame roughly on if you're a patient in California, before you can have an honest discussion with your doctor?
Right. So the law hasn't taken effect yet. It's supposed to take effect January 1st. We were in court on Friday to ask for an injunction against this before it takes effect. So we're hopeful we'll get that decision before January 1st. Of course, we're hopeful it'll be the right decision. It'll stop this thing from taking effect. But there's no guarantee. Again, courts generally can decide things when they feel like it. But I think the judge did give us an emergency hearing on this. I think the judge does appreciate the urgent nature of it. So I'm hopeful that we'll have an answer, and a good one, by the end of the month.
Okay. Sounds good.
Well, certainly that sounds great. Moving along to another topic that certainly impacted a lot of Californians among the rest of the nation as well. And this is a case you guys are involved in as well, but it's the case of this eviction moratorium, which also came out of COVID, government COVID policy. And the idea was that, the government said, well, everybody stay home and nobody can go to work. And then it occurred to the government that, if nobody goes to work, how will people pay their rent? So since people couldn't pay their rent, then he said, oh, well, that's okay. We'll just pass another edict that says people don't have to pay rent now for some period of time. And so this happened around the country. But we certainly saw it here in California as well, with, California leaders jumping on the bandwagon on this enthusiastically, to say the least. and the idea was that if you are a renter, if the person isn't able to pay, you had no ability to kick them out of the home while the emergency was going on. And it's funny, in California, I'm not sure that the emergency has ever ended. But anyways, so what's the status on all this? I know you guys are involved in a lawsuit on this, Jacob. What's going on this issue?
Well, back when the CDC issued its eviction moratorium, we sued on behalf of a landlord to challenge this. And other people did too across the country. And that actually went to the Supreme Court in a different case. And the Supreme Court recognized that, the CDC's authority to do things related to diseases doesn't give them the power to enact an eviction moratorium. I mean, if you can see the sort of super attenuated argument there about how not evicting people would limit the spread of COVID if you accept their other premises about how COVID spreads and is prevented. But the Supreme Court recognized that's going too far. If the CDC can do that in the name of preventing COVID, what can it do? And so, fortunately, that eviction moratorium was struck down, and we don't have that now.
But that moratorium was really kind of discriminatory when you really think about it, because they said nothing about people who pay mortgages. I mean, I pay a mortgage, and they didn't tell me, well, I didn't have to pay the bank. But they said anybody who was a property owner, they had to take it in the shorts just because you're renting property to someone else. But they said nothing about the mortgage holder who's holding the mortgage on that property or holding the mortgage on their own property, their own residence. they're quote unquote protecting the renter. But what about people like us? What about that? So the law to me was discriminatory anyway. But anyway, the Supreme Court said it's not valid. So that's good.
Yeah, well, that's right. And of course, it's an outrageous violation of property rights. And it just illustrates how heedless these people are of the economic harm these things that they do can cause. They just have no sense whatsoever about what the consequences down the line for various people are going to be. It was totally reckless, and at least this one got struck down pretty quickly.
Sure. Yes.
It's funny, Leon, you say that this is discriminatory, but in the end, almost all these laws tend to be discriminatory against people with deep enough pockets that the politicians think they can shove their hand in.
Not to mention, those landlords are evil and should be put down. Never, don't worry about the freeloading renters. Don't worry about them, freeloaders.
Yeah.
Lord.
Well, it is interesting that we saw just all kinds of issues that just sprang from COVID, where it's one thing after another. You lower your principles on essentially your basic liberties, your basic property rights, and there's no end to the costs. And one of the things we saw as well with not just them going after doctors' speech and everybody's speech for that matter, and people's property rights, but they also tried to manipulate the voting laws as well. And this was a case, it seems like there's all kinds of craziness throughout the country where in different instances, they've taken emergency powers to do things that maybe local laws said they couldn't do, but hey, they made exceptions just because it was COVID and everybody was locked in. So hey, we're going to change the voting laws. But one of the cases you guys are involved in, and I thought it was kind of interesting, is in New York. Apparently, you have a case where it was there was a ballot measure. It said where they tried to pass an expansion of absentee voting rights, I guess, or voting, constraints, and they wound up. Voters rejected that, and they said, "Hey, look, we're going to keep it the same way it is." And then the legislature shortly later came back and just pushed it through anyways. And so apparently you guys are fighting those changes by the legislature that seem to be in opposition to what the voters voted for there in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about that one, Jacob?
Yeah, New York's constitution says that you can have absentee, you can let people vote absentee only for a few specified things, one of which is illness. And they tried to amend the Constitution to broaden this, and New York voters, when that was put before them, rejected it. And so then the state legislature turned around and said, well, now voting absentee for illness includes fear of getting an illness. You can have an absentee ballot if you fear getting an illness too. And so that, of course, completely eliminates any real limitation on absentee voting, because anybody could fear getting an illness anytime. Even if we didn't have COVID anymore, you could always get the cold or a cold or the flu or whatever. And so they essentially tried to amend their constitution to say something it doesn't say, because, of course, fearing an illness isn't illness. And limitation that includes fear of illness is no limitation at all. So yes, we sued to challenge this for violating the state's constitution. And of course, people tend to want to expand the absentee voting because it gives more opportunities for certain kinds of mischief. Not saying that's any particular person's motivation, of course, but it opens up opportunities for that kind of trouble. And in any event, the state should be following its own constitution. And so that's what we're pursuing there.
Isn't there a similar case in Pennsylvania also where I believe the state constitution said one thing and I don't know if it was the legislator in that particular case, but it might have been the Secretary of State or the governor, and the state Supreme Court said something else about voting by mail or some kind of stuff like that. Wasn't there a case like that in Pennsylvania also?
Yeah, I don't recall all the details of that, but yes, there was a thing where they essentially changed their voting rules without going through the procedures that they are supposed to do for that. I recall that the Supreme Court had an opportunity to address that, and it was shortly after the 2020 election, as I recall, that the U.S. Supreme Court could have taken that up. And for whatever reason, the court declined to do so. Although, if I recall correctly, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion dissenting from that, saying, like, look, if we are ever going to, like, you know, even if you think we shouldn't jump in right before an election because it's going to disrupt everything and add to the confusion of the state, well, the election's over. Like, if we're ever going to address this, let's address it now. We've got plenty of time before the next election, and that makes a lot of sense. But for whatever reason, the Supreme Court didn't want to do that.
You know, this issue of voting integrity is such an important one, and I really believe the courts are really falling short on this very issue, because if we don't have the right to vote and vote, and when I say the right to vote, I mean to vote in an election with some degree of integrity in terms of our vote, in terms of the content of the vote, and in terms of the exercising of that voting right itself. If we don't have that, then we have nothing. We really have nothing. So I think the courts are really falling short in this regard. And I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, there are, of course, various kinds of election shenanigans going on. That's not to endorse anybody's particular theory of things that were done improperly, but there's no question that there's a need for greater election integrity to ensure that people aren't cheating, and not just cheating and say not counting votes or making up votes or whatever, but in making sure the process is carried out in a fair and predictable way, where you're ensuring that everybody who wants to vote can cast one vote, and that you're not having people kind of you know, with some of this stuff where you round up votes from people and there's not good verification of who actually voted or whether the person actually voted. There's a lot of questionable stuff there, and of course the government manipulates elections in various ways, and they've been doing it for a long time. One way they do it is just through the voting process itself, but they also interfere with elections with, like, the campaign finance rules, where they limit what different people can raise for their campaigns, and they do this in a way that tends to favor the established incumbent candidates who will do well under whatever these rules are and keep out challengers. And that's something that we've focused on for a long time as well. It's something that's a little hard for ordinary people to understand and appreciate, and understandably so, because people aren't thinking about campaign finance. People probably think, yeah, we don't want money in politics anyway, so restrict it. But they do. But, you know, these officials who enact these laws governing our elections, governing campaigns, when it comes to that, they know what they're doing. They're not enacting things out of the goodness of their hearts. They're enacting things to make sure that they stay in power. So there's just a whole lot to do surrounding all this.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, you know, it just seems like this, among many things, is where the government has, if you offer them at all the chance, a crack in the armor to say, hey, emergency powers, you can do whatever you want, we're just going to see that where they just essentially trample and expand government power in all these areas, just crazy. And another case that you guys or did work on, I guess, and this is something where it looks like the executive branch just kind of overrode whatever the the current process is, the APA, in order to essentially force COVID restrictions on a business. And James, maybe we could get the visual up on this. Was a case Nolchek's Meats versus USDA and FI or FSIS. I'm not sure exactly which one that stands for, but essentially, this was a case of a meat packing company. They had been successful locally, and then they had started to go national with their products. So they needed FDA, I guess, stamps on these things in order to be able to sell them throughout the country. And then COVID comes in, a few years after the business really gets up and running. And suddenly they're telling this company, hey, look, you've got to do all this kind of masking and other things internally if you want to keep getting these USDA stamp of approvals on your products. And, again, this is just a thing where they really didn't go through it. It sounds like they did not go through the normal Administrative Procedures Act. They just sort of did this by edict, which seems to be the normal way that the Biden administration responds to everything. And of course, the APA process is meant to ensure that the public has a chance to review these things as they come out, so that there's a review period. And it sounds like it doesn't sound like they really had that. So, Jacob, did you want to jump into this a little more and tell us about this particular case?
Yeah, the USDA basically just decided that to tell people who had meat packaging processing businesses that if you don't start making your employees wear masks, we're not going to give your meat the USDA seal of approval, and so you won't be able to sell your meat. And yes, as you say, they didn't go through the process they should have. They just acted like they could do this under existing rules. And of course, it makes no sense whatsoever, because whatever you think of what masks do otherwise, they certainly don't have anything to do with whether meat processed at a plant is safe to eat. And of course, that's the only thing the USDA is supposed to be concerned about with this. And so we challenged it on behalf of this local business in Wisconsin. And this is a very rare case where the government actually just folded, where they think they just realized we don't have anything here. We can't even defend this, which is pretty extraordinary, because they always have arguments. They'll always and often they don't need a very good argument to get a judge to uphold what they're doing. So this one is especially ridiculous and truly indefensible, to the extent that they couldn't even defend it, and it went away.
Wow. So they folded on the case and quote unquote went home, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They got rid of that rule. They promised to take away anything in our clients' files that showed that they were out of compliance. They wouldn't have like strikes against them for violations. And so it was all undone, fortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah. It's funny because we just saw this insidious nature of government throughout the pandemic, of arbitrary laws, just all kinds of things where, top-down people thought they knew best. We heard about things here in California where I remember one woman who made the news where they forced all kinds of restaurant restrictions on her. She had to have outdoor dining, and she had to have all these different things. And then they shut her down anyways. And then they open up a movie studio thing just down the street where they're serving people outdoors, and it's just like completely arbitrary. Like somehow, well, if the movie studio serves people outdoors, their food will magically be safer and less transmissive than this woman's stuff, and it's sort of who you know and what it's just terrible. But I think we got a lot of that with COVID.
Yeah, and somehow people went along with it for a long time. But I think, fortunately, more and more people are kind of waking up from this nightmare and thinking, what just happened? Why did we do all that? It doesn't make any sense. They're really recognizing the arbitrariness of it. I think as we see more and more information come out about what the government was doing to control the narrative and what they knew, and we see the information coming out of changing people's ideas about the safety of some of the vaccines and all these different things. People are going to wake up to that, and hopefully that means whenever they try the next thing, whatever that's about, people will be more skeptical.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Well, we
because
are.
well, I'll go ahead.
Oh, no,
I'm
no,
sorry.
you go ahead, Tim.
Well, there's also the people that really liked what they did with COVID, and oh my gosh, they couldn't wait to line up to get into the gas chamber, and whatever it happened to be, the flavor of the month. But yeah, so we always have to fight against all this, this backlash against freedom.
Yeah.
That's all.
No, that is the scary thing, how fast 2 weeks to stop the spread turned into just whatever your leader says, do it.
Yeah.
or
Yes.
you're going to lose your job, your license, whatever it may be. You're essentially at the edict of whoever happens to have emergency powers. But we are getting.
You can put on your Facebook profile, we can do this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, we are getting close to the end of the show. And one of the things we always like to do as we wrap up our podcast is to talk about something kind of silly somebody has done in the media or a politician has said, our Knucklehead Noise Patrol. In this case, it's not so much something. Well, I guess they kind of said it. It was the New York Times recently put out a thing of the 93 most stylish people of 2022. And apparently, according to the New York Times, it sounds like Shrek is in this year because John Fetterman is apparently one of their most stylish people. So I don't know exactly how they make these choices. And of course, for those of you who might not be familiar, John Fetterman recently won is a Democrat who won for Senate in Pennsylvania this year in kind of one of the most dubious races between him and Dr. Oz. And it seemed like it was kind of a race to the bottom. But apparently, the New York Times is telling us he is one of the most stylish people. So, do you guys have any thoughts on the style?
Well, you don't have to have a brain where these people are concerned, okay? Because they elected Biden and they elected Fetterman. You don't have to have a brain, okay? So all they have to do is to look good enough to get by the process, and it's good enough for the New York Times and for everybody else, okay? So. Cognitive decline is on the incline in the Democratic Party and in some voters' minds. God.
I'm the guy with the matching kerchief in his sport coat that goes with my shirt that I'm happen to be wearing. So I don't want to judge the sweatshirt wearing, short basketball shorts or whatever they wear. Shrek or whoever that was, Fetterman.
You don't want to judge? Tim, that's all we do on this show, man. We make judgments. Some of them are quite wrong, but we make judgments, man. Come on.
Too early.
Does look like the gym attire is in for Philadelphia Senate candidates. I guess. Well, I don't know. We are about at the end of the show, so Jacob, did you have any last thoughts you wanted to share with us, or any information about your organization, Liberty Justice Center, that you wanted to share with the audience?
Well, yeah, I would say definitely check out our website, libertyjusticecenter.org. If you have seen something you think is a violation of constitutional rights or overreach by government and you think somebody ought to sue over it, please feel free to contact us and let us know. Of course, we can't take on everything that's out there, but we're always looking for new opportunities to do that across the country. And of course, if you see what we're doing and you like our work and you want to support it with a donation, we always appreciate that too at libertyjusticecenter.org.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us today. And we really felt like you definitely educated us on some of this stuff, and hopefully you educated our listeners as well. So thank you for joining us, and all of you out there, thank you for joining us as well. And until next time, stay free.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Jacob. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at knuckleheadsofliberty.com.